Okay, well, happy Tuesday, everyone, and glad that you're able to join us today. We are going to get started with our meeting today, and I'm very glad that you're all able to make it. I am Gail Saunders, and I will be facilitating our discussion today. If we can go ahead and begin our PowerPoint, and we'll just give a quick update on our agenda. This is our second steering committee meeting, and we're very excited about the work that is happening in our quarters, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. But today we're going to hear from Joanna, who's going to open us up and give us some remarks to get us started. We'll talk a little bit about the coalition and the survey that many of you participated in. Thank you for that. You're going to hear from the peer cities. You asked to learn a little more, so we have that for you. And then, as you can see, additional information. Today, we really want to have some discussions with you. So every step along the way, we'll pause and have an opportunity to engage with you. And then Rory will close by sharing our next steps and what's coming up for our next meeting. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the CEO, President of Coda, Joanna Pinkerton. Thank you so much, Joanna. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gail. Can you hear me all right? Great. Good afternoon. It's really great to see all of the faces today. I just want to thank you again for joining us as we're taking a really important step today in determining our region's future. This is a collaboration between Coda, the City of Columbus, Franklin County, Morpsy, and each of you here today. And this is really going to determine how we grow as a connected, sustainable region, how we choose to shape our communities for the tremendous growth that we're already seeing, as well as the growth that future generations can expect, and really how removing equity barriers can ensure that we're seeking a prosperity agenda for everyone who calls Central Ohio home. I want to call out my fellow co-chairs, Jennifer Gallagher and William Murdoch, because I know they're just as excited about engaging. You know, your commitment to this effort, really, it makes us feel like every day is worth it. So in the last meeting, we discussed the concept and the visioning of LinkUS, and I know that was a lot to digest. But I'm going to assure you that today is going to be just as intense, but it's going to be a little more of a deeper dive today into what we consider program alignment, walking you through some priority networks, sharing criteria of how we could possibly determine priorities. And this is a really strong agenda. Those are big concepts to think about and steps to actually move things forward. But I'm confident that we have the right people in the room. You are here not only because of your leadership in your respective roles, but because of your impact on the community. Your thoughtful input and guidance today is really important. Dialogue is appreciated and it's necessary. And I feel really compelled to just say that I want to remind us of our why. Today's going to be a lot of how, but I want to ground us as we start with our why. Because I can assure you, based on what we've seen on our nation's history, the growth that we're seeing in comparative regions when it comes to public infrastructure, supporting social infrastructure, I can assure you that we are at a generational moment of choosing to make bold investments in our community. We're already the second largest city in the Midwest. Think about it. We're just shy of 1 million people in the city, based on the new census. We're part of a region that's almost 2.2 million people now, growth of more than 12% in the last decade. Moments in time like this do not happen very often. Systems which were built 70 or more years ago do not fit us anymore. It's time for us to reimagine them, reuse them, upgrade them based on what we need to serve future residents and future businesses. And personally, I'm excited that that type of a moment is at hand for us, because I think each of us in our own way, as I look at the faces on this screen, I think we each have a great capacity and compassion to leave things better than we found them. So what you see today is really based on years of research, study, planning, and analysis, which has helped us learn from other regions who are getting it right. And also learning from those who did not convene groups like this when their moment came. And now they're trying to figure out how to build out of a lack of infrastructure investment. So I'm glad we're here. I'm glad we're convened. I want to thank you for your willingness to muscle through this today. And really, let's take the hard work that the team has done behind the scenes and bring it into this forum for recommendations and decision making. With that, Gail, I'll turn it back over to you, but thanks for letting me make some remarks.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you so much. We have big work ahead of us, as Joanna said, and one of the things that we want to continue to do is probe and see and get your thoughts and your insights. And so one of the things we did over the last 2 weeks or so is we've been reaching out to you to take a brief survey. And so thanks to all of you who've had a chance to do that. And so we got some very interesting insights from you. And so at this point, we want to walk you through a high level of the findings from that brief survey. And then we'll have a discussion about that. So if you would be willing to share, Justin, the screen, and we'll walk through that survey. And so the first question we asked was, certainly many of you know, and you know the 6 priorities for LinkUS. We wanted you to rank them in order of importance. And what we found is that equity, certainly you rank them as number 1. And this is a aggregate of the data. And then when we looked at the rest of those 6 priorities, sustainability and workforce advancement really played a big role. We had 24 participants to partake in the survey, which for a 32-member committee, we felt really, really strong about that. Some people were out of town, others, some did say they'd be able to take it a little later. So we're very pleased with those results. If we go to the next slide, I want to go a little deeper so you can see exactly how that plays out from a data point perspective. We know you love data. So as you can see, equity and sustainability and workforce advancement are the top 3. And it really does align with what we found in other surveys. As you know, we had a very strong and robust public engagement process with the Northwest Corridor as well as the East-West Corridor. And those 3 always bubble to the top. So it is what you're telling us is in line with what we're hearing from the community as well. As we go to the next slide and the next question, we asked, okay, so you prioritized your 6 principles, but why? And so some of the why really does center on, they ranked equity first, because when you think about the advancement that have been in our community, equity really can level up and reduce some of the other things that are happening in our community, such as crime and safety. And so that was one of the reasons why. When we talked about sustainability, sustainability is key to maintaining strength for any community. And person also weaved in the equity piece to that as well. And so another piece that came up in some of your comments was economic development. It really is focused on equity, and it's the best way to improve lives and prosperity for all of our citizens. And then another comment, we just picked these randomly. Yes. Do I have a question? Another one of these, we picked these randomly, is that all of these things are important. All 6 of the priorities are important, but we need an integrated workforce advancement plan, which leads to housing stability, increased quality of life, and provides a stronger platform for improved equity. So those were some of the comments, and we'll send this certainly out to you after our meeting, but If we go to the next slide and the next question, what were some of the aligned initiatives that you believe are the most important to LinkUS for us to be able to deliver a comprehensive, equitable mobility growth and prosperity strategy for our region? And you selected up to 3. And one of the things that we found here, it's very interesting, is that as you look at the pieces that really came to life for you, zoning code updates was a strong leader, as well as the regional housing strategy. And then coupled with that, as a number 3 and very closely aligned, was the Rise Together Blueprint report. And so we had a number of aligned initiatives that we talked about in our last meeting. We listed all of those. And so very interesting finding, and actually in line with what we've heard before from the community. As we go to our next slide, we did ask you to identify any additional initiatives that were not listed. And this is the list of initiatives that came to light. Coda sales tax expansion. We talked about the zoning code update. Future Ready Columbus was certainly mentioned, and the United Way. Of course, the regional housing strategy was a strong leader. So someone said they would have included that as a 4th, but as you see in the data, it came out strong as a initiative that is very important to be aligned to. You can see the CAP, the Urban Forestry Master Plan, Active Transportation Plan. That plan needs to be aligned. Transit-oriented development. And of course, the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio and all that work that is happening in that space. As we look at our next question, and we thought it'd be fun to do a word cloud for you, how would you measure success for LinkUS? Or what does success look like to you? And overwhelmingly, the big pieces that were some of the takeaways, corridors and having a connected, aligned corridor strategy was good. You can see change. The larger the font, the more people had a sense around that word. Cars, and when we talk about cars, we'll go a little deeper in terms of what people were saying about that. Workforce development, jobs, and just the need for an aligned approach. And so when we look at that a little deeper in our next slide, some of those things that really resonated is success for LinkUS means constructing a world-class transit system. It also is about creating a thriving community that is connected and healthy because of access to healthy air, food, jobs, and housing. Talked about the mobility corridors and making sure that that is realized and that we move forward with that approach. Completion of the backbone of better connected transit and bikeways that involve the mode shift. And that's some of the things that you talked about in your last meeting that was very important as well. And then ridership, a living wage so that people are able to get to those higher paying jobs and all those service and all those opportunities up and down the corridors. At the end of the day, what this says to us is that we really want a comprehensive plan that ties everything together. And so the other piece about cars, people want a reduction of the dependence on cars. And that's why you saw in the word cloud, that was a word that really bubbled up as something that is very important to those who were able to take the survey. And then as we go to our next slide, so what were some of the key takeaways from what we heard, the data points, and also your comments? Equity is critical to every aspect of the LinkUS planning model. Everything we do, equity has to be that lead part of the framework. Workforce advancement, how people get to higher paying jobs, and everything up and down the corridors that leads to workforce advancement. It needs to be a strong consideration. aligning the corridors across the region. And across the region, and I'll say that again because region was certainly something that each of you emphasized, the region, to connect jobs, housing, business development, and overarching development. And then sustainability. We've heard it before. We hear it from you and other members of other committees. We've got to build a connected system that is sustainable, and it advances the climate action plan. And so we want to take a few minutes to pause and give you an opportunity to share any other insights that you may have. If you are comfortable sharing, just raise your hand. Of course, you'd be comfortable, raise your hand and we'll call on you. Or if you'd prefer to put something in the chat, we'll make sure that we capture those as well. So this is an opportunity to have some dialogue. Those findings were very aligned, as I mentioned, to what we've heard from the community before. We did see some new things from you, but most importantly, that alignment and that being very deliberate about it. And then also we had a comment in the survey that said, hey, the time is now. We've been talking, we've been studying, we need to move forward. And so any insights, any additional conversation that any of you have related to those findings? Any questions?
Yes, Gail, I have my hand up.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm as well as can be expected, in considering, the loss that many of us have been experiencing
Yes.
with COVID. Well, first of all, thank you. It's always great to have this data that supports what we've been talking about for a long time now. And so having it on paper, is very helpful, or in a, format that we can share with individuals. I just want to share that and this put out there that, there is still sort of an angst and definitely an urgency for those community members who, again, have a lack of direct access to transportation to work. And so, when we think about, and I'm going to say, the primary community that I work with is within the immigrant refugee community. And we know that many of them have jobs that are, in the surrounding, right outside of Central Ohio. But even if it's not, quick, easy access is really critical to the community in getting to work and not having to be exchange, buses, go on different lines. So getting to work easy, coming from work, and sometimes the hours, because their shifts are in, I would say, kind of, it would be dangerous for someone to be out that late, commuting. So just keeping in mind that there is an urgency. There has been an urgency for a long time, but the more we talk about workforce development, that's, that is at the most highest of barriers, is access to transportation to work. And even for those that aren't working, again, like in the outlying 270 corridor, it's still a barrier. So, I just want to put that at the forefront. And as we, really look for these areas of connecting, and I'm sure that this will be an area for those that are on that line. I just want to tell you that, even in the conversations I've been in this summer, it's still a top priority.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lupe, and we really do appreciate that, and very important. And that is something that has been a consistent thought and a consistent concern that we've heard in the community as well. So, and it showed up in our data. So thank you for that. Any other comments?
I had a, oh, sorry. Someone was
Thank you. Thank you. Kumi?
Yeah, hi, Kumi Walker. I had a question or first comment. So I think most times that this type of scale of a development historically have ever been done. It's been done at the expense of non-white, non-wealthy people. There's a lot of study and research about this. My favorite book about it is Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, where he talks about it. There's a lot of history actually in Central Ohio about this. And I just want to make sure, I guess the question is like, are there models of communities that have ever done this scale of development where that hasn't been the impact? And if not, what resources globally, or experts globally, are we pulling in to ensure that we don't just do the same thing that we did the last time we invested in infrastructure like this in Central Ohio?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think some of that you'll see in our peer cities information that we're sharing, and we're going to bring some additional experts from across the country to you so you can speak to them directly in our October meeting. But I know that Kim and others can respond to some of that as well, Morpsy as well. So thank you for that question. Yes, we are working outward and bringing experts from across the country.
So Gail, one of the things that I was thinking about in answering the survey, especially when we're talking about equity, is the value of people's times from different socioeconomic groups and racial groups, and how disproportionate that has been. And so, we know right now that people who don't have a car, whether they're walking, biking, or taking the bus, their time is kind of devalued in getting to do the necessary things of life. And so when we're talking about success metrics, I think that's the biggest one for me is with this initiative is how do we make it so that we're rebalancing that for the people on the lower end of that scale there and giving them the same type of dignity and value to their time in their travel.
Excellent, thank you. I think that also aligns with Lupe, who was talking about that last mile and how long it gets to and from some of those jobs. So thank you for that. Thank you. And Josh, I do see your comment in the chat, and Kathy as well. And so when we talk about, I'll start with what are the metrics to measure the success? How will metrics be decided and goals be set? A conversation that we'll be certainly driving toward. And that is part of the role that this committee will play, as well as moving up forward to the executive committee. So we'll talk more about that, as well as making sure that what this survey is, this is really to help us get an understanding of what your thoughts and your priorities are. We're not doing this in isolation, Josh. Of course, there will be other surveys along the way from a broader community perspective. And some of the other things that we talked about at our previous meeting is the community survey that does occur on a regular basis as well. And so very focused surveys will be done as we go along the way, Josh, related to funding as we move forward, when we move forward with those conversations. So anyone else want to add to that from the team?
Yeah, Gail, I want to jump in real quick and just say that, obviously this is something that for a long time. I'm just excited that we're here and taking the steps to actually implement and execute. As a native New Yorker, right, who has also had the opportunity to live in different parts of the country, when I look at this type of transportation, it's essential, right? It's not even like a nice to have, it's like, it's essential. And growing up in an environment where this is how, mass transit is how I got around every single day, to and from school, to and from. And I know that, we talk advancement piece that will be a critical part. So when we look at the disparities that exist, there's some metrics out there that talk about, I think the average American has like less than $400 in disposable income right now. So if their car broke down, they literally couldn't get they couldn't pay to fix it right now without a loan or some help. And you think about even those people that have jobs, but may potentially lose their job if something like that one situation, that one incident happens, that's an unforgiven for them to get to and from work. So just excited to see where we are, because it will definitely transform the way people can live their lives.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we see
Gail,
Mr. Steiner, yes?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's very important that we use those transit corridors to help with housing problem in our city. And I'm not talking about as a principle or feel good kind of initiative. We have to understand there's a pot of money. That is, every time someone does not have a car, that household saves about $8,000 a year. Every time a developer does not have to build 2 parking spaces per apartment, saves $30,000 to $60,000 a year. So there is money there. That money will go to the pocket of the developer by charging more rent, getting it from the people who save their cars, or not building the infrastructure. So it's essential that as we are planning those corridors, we work with the city to create entitlement formulas, tax abatements, and structures so that those dollars are conveyed into making housing more affordable along the transit corridors. I know right now there's many initiatives. There might be people from the county listening to this. And their initiative we are taking citywide. Why just the corridors? Let's do it everywhere. We can do that tomorrow. That is true. But if you read the Inside 2050 report you gave us, basically 60% of the future growth and the jobs will be on the corridors. So there it is going to happen. So why worry about affordability in a place when there's no infrastructure, there's no benefit, there's nothing, you have to subsidize everything, where in a corridor, you are saving $8,000 a year to the family, and you are saving the developer 2 parking spaces per apartment, which is worth anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000. That money has been channeled entirely into making housing more affordable. It has to be systematic, built into the corridor analysis. So our job is not only to pick whether it's a trolley or a train or light rail and how wide the road, is also to make sure that the corridors come with legal infrastructure for entitlements and other things who make the housing possible. That money has to be channeled into it. And that's very important for equity. That's a real concrete thing. It's not just wishing. It's, if everybody believes in that, then we need to draft the language. What is affordable housing? How do we make it affordable? How do money get there? What is if there's a TIF on the corridors, how do we structure it? I mean, all those things. I mean, I will keep saying this, because that I think is the most important thing that we can make a difference other than moving people, giving them access, etc. We need to, today we are 40% short in housing delivery. Forget about the attainable housing, any housing, workforce housing, for the teacher, for the firefighter, for the police officer, they cannot afford to live in town. So anyway, so that's my message.
Thank you so much, Jamir. And Kumi, that really does talk about doing things differently than what we've done before, and really focused on that from a broader perspective. Any other, Craig, you have your hand up. You have a question from Craig?
No, actually, a comment. I just wanted to follow on a couple of last 2 comments because they're very good. When we're looking at kind of how you group these categories of strategies and goals, they're really kind of falling into 2 big buckets in a sense. One is mobility. That's where we're talking about the corridors, the first mile, last mile, those kinds of issues. And a lot of this, though, is outside of pure mobility in itself. It's human infrastructure. It's as we're pointing out, workforce development, economic development, and zoning is probably the key governmental connection to achieving those goals. So what drives my thinking on this is this does need a regional approach too. We can't just focus on the urban corridors because, first of all, a lot of the job development is currently outside of 270 or around that area. We're seeing shifting ED, economic development patterns, and that drives the mobility as well. We also need to think in terms of, as we work through how to do this, Coda's certainly got a key role in it because it's the mobility provider. And a lot of what Coda does now can be expanded to address some of these problems. What Lupe is talking about, first mile, last mile, that's where the on-demand service like Coda Plus comes into play. And you're seeing it now in the south side of Columbus, Westerville, and it's, it may happen in Dublin. You start linking up the corridors with the ability to get to and from your job or to and from your home to the bus stop too. So those important initiatives. but I think we have to think regionally because, and this is the time for big thinking. We have I think Joanna pointed out, I mean, this is our opportunity as a region to actually do something that's really, transformative for the future. It's kind of a pivotal time. So I think I encourage everybody to think big and whatever it takes, to make this happen and bring all those components, the human infrastructure and the mobility infrastructure together in one piece. They'll have separate funding sources, but the vision has to be coherent. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you all for your comments and for sharing. And if anyone has any other thoughts about this, just drop it in the chat. We're going to move forward with our agenda. We wanted to, you asked us last meeting about the regional perspective that Craig just mentioned as well. And so we did move on that, and we have some information we wanted to share about the meeting that was held a couple of weeks ago. And so with that, we have Thea from Morpsy who will give us that update. Thea?
Excuse me. Thank you, Gail. Yes, we did hold a meeting to discuss the priority network of projects at Morpsy. It was on September 15th, which was last Wednesday, following the LinkUS at CMC that we did. So a lot of folks came from one to the other. And as you can see here, a number of entities across Franklin County were invited to participate in that. And we did have many show up in person as well as online. It was a hybrid meeting that we did our very best to accommodate everybody and have them participate. We still have a number of key communities missing, and we are following up with them. I can share a couple of them as they were cities: Bexley, Reynoldsburg, Grove City, New Albany, Worthington, and a handful of townships as well. I won't run through all those, but we'll be following up with those who did not attend, because getting all of that information is very important. And really for us, what we were really trying to get down to was to identify those connecting projects or priority elements like bikeways, greenways, sidewalks, roadways, and transit facilities that were either in their capital plans or on the Morpsy Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And basically the idea is that these were projects that were planned in the future already, and that could be really a part of the part and parcel package of what we see for the future here. So we really had a pretty focused discussion on that. There were a number of questions and concerns that were shared. I won't go through all of them, but many of them had to really do with kind of that interaction of the bus or transit system, such as the vending and marketplaces, bus stops and shelter improvements, and just kind of the interaction between that and the bike and pedestrian facilities. Also, some overall thoughts were just the different mapping between AECOM and Kimley Horn, just trying to bring all that together in a very comprehensive way. And then just ensuring that we're capturing everything that everybody wants. So what we'll be doing next from that workshop is we're actually putting on an online mapping tool to provide feedback so that they can provide feedback on our draft priority network system that we shared with them. So there'll be a chance for them to get online and make those edits or make comments on what they've seen and what they want to put in there, in addition to what we may have already found in some of their plans and our plans. And we have to receive those comments by October 1st. So it's a very quick turnaround, and we did mention that. And then we're going to make our final recommendation to the Leadership Coalition, and we're going to tie that up with the financial obligations. Getting some feedback here. And we do plan to continue pulling this group back together on a quarterly basis. We want to continue this conversation. And that was one of the things that I really hit on drove home is the fact that this is not just a Morpsy, Coda, City of Columbus conversation. This is a Franklin County, in some ways, even a little just on the edges beyond that. But certainly, every entity in Franklin County needs to be at the table, and so we're going to continue having those conversations with them and bringing them into that table. It's just really critical. I think they got it. I think we still have some work to do with those who maybe didn't attend or have been continually in discussions with us but couldn't attend that day. But I'm pretty happy with the overall turnout, considering the hybrid meeting format, and maybe not everybody could attend that day, but it was a good start. So I'm willing to take any questions.
Very good. Thank you, Thea. And in addition to that touch point with that technical group, other touch points with various other levels of our regional leaders is occurring as well. So we wanted you to know that we are certainly making sure that we're having all of those touch points along the way. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Kim Sharp, who is going to give us an update on the peer cities and talk about some things that we'll have for you in October. Kim?
Great, thanks, Gail. I'm going to move quickly only because we have a lot of awesome stuff to talk about today. You had a couple of questions last month, and one specifically, what's the mode share of the other cities we were comparing ourselves to? And this is in the State of Mobility report, and we added also the population growth. So you can see that Columbus is growing at a rate that's comparing the 2010 and the 2020 census. This is city population. This is done just to compare apples to apples. We know that all of these areas have MSAs, larger areas, of course. So the mode share you see for Columbus is about 3% utilize public transit on a daily basis. So the comparisons here, the highest here is Minneapolis at 13%. I know that Seattle's is around 10%, but we're not that much lower than some of the other communities. We're actually a little bit higher than a couple of the communities such as Nashville and Indianapolis. So this all information will be available to you afterwards, but let's go ahead and move forward. The reason we're going to bring some cities to visit with us next month, it'll either be virtual or in person, we're trying to figure that out, is to really understand, these are also cities who've spent years planning and they are implementing. And the question is, how did you get to this implementation stage? What are those lessons learned for us and what can we learn from you? I'm just going to point out a couple of things regarding some of these cities. Charlotte is one of the cities that will be visiting us next month. They're a little bit ahead of us. They have a group of community leaders, just like this group together, the Mobility Task Force, and they're putting together that detailed plan and an understanding of how it can be paid for. What's really interesting in Charlotte is how closely they've connected their long-term comprehensive plan to their unified development ordinance, their zoning code. And that's closely connected to their strategic mobility plan. And I like how they worded it. It's a vision for their growth, the rules for their growth, and the strategy to connect it. It really gives you that holistic picture. So if we move on to the next city, no, this is Charlotte. I actually really appreciated how they spent time, and this is what they're in the middle of, and this team will do the same thing, understanding potential, possible funding, financing sources for the different elements of their big picture vision. We know that the rapid transit and the bus systems could be extremely expensive, and you're going to see a lot of the infrastructure is expensive. How is it connected? How are we being efficient? How are the thoughts of different funding sources? This was a great graphic, how they're looking into that. Next slide. Indianapolis. This is actually a really easy city to go visit if you'd like to experience. The red line is up and running. It's a true BRT with a center boarding. It's very interesting. And the purple line and green lines are both, purple line and blue lines are in the queue, in the federal queue for funding. And this is how they worked on it through a referendum. And what's really interesting, they did develop about the same time a transit-oriented development strategic plan that was done through the city of Indianapolis. And together there's some partnerships they've developed to integrate affordable housing into the new development around the stations. Next slide. Austin, we'll be talking to Austin also. In more detail, you'll have time to Q&A with them. Their project is called Project Connect. It's pretty huge. They did a referendum last year for a $7.5 billion system. The elements include quite a bit of things. They're supportive elements. This is just an example. They are zoning for TOD around the stations. And the next slide, I just wanted to point out one thing, how their ballot initiative, and this was actually shown last month, but I think it would be good for us to take a minute and look at this. The propositions on their ballot really did separate the transit pieces with some transit supportive anti-displacement housing as that package. And then they had the other mobility items as another package. And that's just how their team, they had a team similar to this that worked together for quite some time. That's how their team felt it would work best for their community. And that's how they're moving forward with their large holistic vision of Project Connect. The next city is Minneapolis. What's interesting about Minneapolis, a couple things. One, they're a much more compact city. It's very walkable. It's smaller in square miles, but they have a huge bicycle infrastructure that's part of their culture. Another thing that I think is very interesting is a nonprofit. It's not part of the corridors or the transit group. It's not part of the city, but it's called Corridors of Opportunity. And it's a group that really focuses on the development, equitable access, shared prosperity, how affordable housing is integrated into the corridors. And that is all part of their metrics and their goals. So feel free to go online. We'll share all this information with you. You can dive into that deeper. That has been going on for quite a few years. So getting those updated reports, I think, would be good for this team to see how successful that is. Next slide. We wanted to just bring a few Insight 2050 corridor concept slides back because a lot of work went into this. A lot was learned from this, and there was a lot of public engagement and public discussions. Because a big part of this is the mobility system that gets us around, but it's also the focused growth that will allow us to be the sustainable community that we envision. So the benefits of focused growth, of course, is it accommodates most of needed housing. And we have some statistics, Yarmer already pointed some of them out. It does have lower capital and operating costs if you don't keep growing out, but you utilize your roadways, your water, and your sewer infrastructure you have. You have much greater access to jobs, higher per acre tax revenues, much greater transit use. We'll see that mode share go up if we have focused growth around the transit areas. Lower greenhouse gas emissions is a huge goal. Household level auto utility savings, quite a bit. And it does save some green space and some farmland. So if we go to the next slide, some of the biggest points from Insight 2050 corridor concepts that just analyzing 5 of the many more than that corridors in the next gen plan. They analyzed 5 corridors. Those corridors could accommodate 55% of the new needed households and 60% of the new jobs along those corridors, which really makes other modes of transportation, walking, biking, and transit, an easier choice because it's right there. That gives you better access to jobs and the other things we pointed out. The $8,500 less cost per household. I think there's a chart that goes with this. If it pops up, there we go. And this is exactly what Yarmir was talking about. Really, you save quite a bit of money in your household with this way of growing. And then we go on to the next slide. There are regional benefits in growing this way, higher tax revenues per acre, less infrastructure costs in the long run. But and it does help increase the mode share. We would see the mode share go up quite a bit and other means of people getting around. I think I have one more slide. And then the question is, how does Insight 2050 corridor concepts is now very much a part of the LinkUS language. And really this focused growth is about the transit, land use, and community priorities aligning. And the principles of transit supportive design is the buildings and blocks, the open space, the streetscapes, the mobility. It's how we design our streets. It is the zoning code and the transit and the mobility options that connect it all. And there, one more slide. And just, this is actually, I stole this from the Northwest Corridor Mobility Study, phase 1, that's online. This has really good information, very good ideas about transit supportive design, transit oriented design, what we should be thinking about seriously along our corridors. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Kim. We'll have some time for questions for this and our priority networks discussion. And as we are transitioning to Justin for that, I'd like for each of you, if you don't mind putting your names in the chat for us. We like to do this at every meeting, see who's with us. And so you can see who is here as well. So if you can just put your name and the company you're with in the chat for us, we would appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Gail. Good to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, building on some of the introduction we had to this concept of priority networks at our first meeting, and then hand it over to members of our two consultant teams, AECOM and Kimley Horn, who are helping us to move through a technical analysis to identify these potential program elements and projects to be advanced with LinkUS. Recall at our last meeting, we talked about these various buckets of potential investment with a focus on the mobility side of this, but obviously we've talked even today about how other non-infrastructure, non-direct mobility investments tie together with this through human infrastructure and housing. Today, for this next section of the presentation, we are going to focus on the more traditional mobility, hard infrastructure investments, but always we have this bigger picture in mind. So we're looking at what could emerge as high priority transportation projects that promote regional multimodal connectivity, creating an integrated, robust system, and identifying those pieces of plans that our region has already undertaken that we can prioritize to advance the goals of LinkUS and these larger community goals that we've been talking about through this meeting and other engagement. And through all of this, as Gail identified earlier, making sure that we're building an equity lens into all of our prioritization. So, as I noted, we're not really creating a new plan here. We're building on a lot of great planning that our region has already undertaken. Much of this has been advanced and synthesized through Morpsy's work with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan that was updated last year. Coda, of course, has their next gen plan, which is a foundational element of LinkUS. We have the Vision Zero Columbus effort. Morpsy has a Central Ohio Transportation Safety Plan. We have the Central Ohio Greenways Regional Trail Vision. These are just some examples of all this great systems planning that's already been done. There's no shortage of documentation of need for mobility investment. Now we need to identify what are the elements of these different plans that align most directly with the objectives of this initiative. Mentioned equity, both Jen McNeil-Dodwell and Andy Schneider are going to talk about how we're building equity into this technical analysis process. I just did want to highlight sort of the backbone of this equity analysis is we're looking at potential mobility projects and moving through this analysis of existing plans. We're building on an assessment of equity that was developed for our Vision Zero effort here at the City of Columbus, and also coordinating that with work that Morpsy's led through the first mile, last mile, and Cog Trail prioritization work through Central Ohio Greenways. And so we'll use this term called communities of interest that is representing a series of census blocks, not just within the City of Columbus, but throughout the Franklin County area that have a high propensity of a series of sociodemographic indicators that you can see on this slide here. So when you hear that term and see this series of orange areas on maps that are going to be shared momentarily, you'll understand that that's what's going into identifying those areas, and that's representing this equity screening. So again, priority network elements, we're looking at transit, we're looking at greenways, bikeways, our sidewalk system, as well as potentially roadway projects, complete street projects, and how they may have a nexus to some of these other multimodal systems that we're looking at. And a few important considerations as we move into this more technical review. Again, we're trying to identify a transformational mobility system, an interconnected system with these different modes that support each other and advance larger community goals. I want to emphasize this is all very much draft. These are potential projects and potential program elements that we're trying to identify how they align with community priorities. This discussion that we'll have here today is really intended to inform and help refine this process as we move forward. On some of these slides, you are going to see some cost ranges. They're going to be some pretty big numbers. I want to emphasize these are early preliminary order of magnitude and planning level cost figures that are necessary for our teams to take us through a financial modeling process as we approach this next phase of work where we're starting to look at funding options and funding strategies. Nothing here at this time is an actual proposed program. This is a starting point so that we can work through conversation with this steering committee and with the executive committee to help identify what makes the most sense for Central Ohio to emerge as a program to be advanced forward with the community. And finally, aside from cost, we think it's really important to remind ourselves that we need to focus on what brings the most value to the community. What's going to bring the biggest return on investment? Again, big numbers, big costs, potentially, but this is about investing in the community and keeping that in mind as we think about how we prioritize what may emerge through a program in working with this leadership coalition. So with that, I'm going to hand it over first to Jen with AECOM to walk us through the transit component of the priority networks analysis.
Great, thank you very much, Justin. So the next couple of minutes, I hope will whet your appetite and get you excited about the transit part of the LinkUS vision. Justin, if you would like to click forward, please. The pieces that compose the transit universe of elements are grouped into 5 categories broadly. So first of all, we have the high capacity rapid transit corridors. These are some of the major projects that are already advancing in the region, and you may be familiar with their progress. They sort of form the backbone of the transit infrastructure. I'll be describing some service improvements, another set of capital improvements, which are separate and apart from the high capacity rapid transit corridors, but represent the development of physical infrastructure that would enhance mobility in the region. There's some exciting technology innovations that present as opportunities. And then finally, sort of on the softer side, there's a series of programs, policies, and partnerships that will compose part of the program and really, again, sort of enhance this notion of providing an end-to-end point A to point Z way for people to get around the region in a comfortable and efficient manner. So next slide, you may have seen the map. Or before I get into that, kind of building upon the point that Justin touched on in his concluding slide, how do we start to organize these components, both the transit pieces as well as the non-transit mobility components? We've looked at a whole series of data that could help us organize a phasing or a staging program for all of these pieces. And the notion is, again, to understand how we can best serve the population in the region, but also group these things together so that they represent the most effective investment on the part of the whole region and really augmenting, as I said, the way for people to get from point A to point Z where they want to go in the most efficient manner. So these are some of the factors that we've used to organize our projects. And the first set of these would be the high capacity rapid transit corridors. So there, you've seen over the years study of corridors throughout the region through the Next Gen, the Insight 2050, and into the LinkUS program, identification of these major corridors that would benefit from high capacity rapid transit. As you know, there are 3 corridors that are entering FTA project development stage of study right now. So these are the Northwest Corridor, East Main, and West Broad. There are 5 other corridors in addition to those 3 that are in sort of the nearer term and contemplation for study. And these align with the priorities that have been articulated in these prior studies, as well as generally aligning with the region's metropolitan transportation program. We recognize that there were a whole number of other corridors that had been studied over the years in these plans. And so these will be teed up for future consideration, but we've got 8 identified right out of the gate that can really provide extensive service to the region. So the preliminary capital cost ranges for this series of 8 corridors is in the neighborhood of $3.5 to $4.5 billion. This represents capital investment, and we would be exploring possibilities for cost sharing, particularly under FTA's capital improvement grant program, in terms of where does this money come from. You'll also see, as Justin pointed out in our presentation of these transit mobility element ideas to you today, an overlay of how they will serve the communities of interest in the region. So you can see how the investments correspond to the areas that you all have already pointed out are in greatest need and would benefit substantially from improved transportation opportunities. Next slide, please. So besides those trunk line high capacity rapid transit corridors, there's a whole universe of projects on the service side that we are exploring for ways to provide additional access for people to get around the region. So we will be exploring expansions to the mobility on demand services. So you know those as Coda Plus and mainstream on demand. There's also Coda's substantial fixed route network across the region. So we will be looking at, in alliance with the Next Gen plan, ways that we can expand those fixed routes for greater spatial coverage, as well as looking at the service hours. So this would be expanding additional late night service hours, for example, increasing frequency. And Coda is always looking at its service operations to make sure that its network aligns with where people are and where they need to go. So looking at realignments, tweaks to routes, new routes, etc. And then on the topic of micromobility, looking at ways to partner with vendors for kind of first mile, last mile sorts of connections. Next slide, please. So here you have an image of what Coda's fixed route network looks like relative to the region. When you add in, click forward, please, the high capacity network, you can see how this really provides substantial coverage to the region. And some of the additional projects that we're proposing as part of the service improvements group of investments, Justin, click forward, please, would be the on-demand kinds of service. So you see in purple, the existing suite of Coda Plus on-demand zones. And then in pink are areas where we may consider expanding Coda Plus zones or adding new zones. Together with the green micro-mobility dots, you can see how this corresponds to the orange areas, the community of interest. And so how kind of all together the network of service that could be provided from the high capacity corridors, the fixed route service, the on-demand services, and these little micro-mobility points really provides pretty substantial coverage across the region. Next slide, please. So the next category of things that I'd like to preview for you would be additional capital improvement projects. So these are kinds of physical infrastructure investments. We're not talking about the things that are components of the high capacity network. Those are all kind of encompassed within the corridor needs for the high capacity rapid transit corridors that we talked about a couple of minutes ago. But these are additional kinds of investments that really enhance the transit universe. So intermodal connectivity, these are opportunities to invest in places along routes that allow people to transfer between transit routes or between modes. So these are places like transit centers, park and rides or mobility hubs. So these investments include the physical places as well as kind of the information and the services that make them easier to use and easier to transfer facilities. Vending marketplaces are kind of enhancements to some of these places where we can utilize transit and the transit infrastructure to provide access to transit riders to goods and services to make their life easier. So things like food markets, Amazon pickup lockers, micro markets, things like that. Just thinking about ways that infrastructure partnerships can be explored to make the journey for users of the system more pleasant, efficient, and so on, not just for the core transportation service. Electrification is a big topic among transit agencies and transportation providers across North America and across the world. So looking at opportunities for Coda to introduce electrification to its system entails looking at upgrades to its vehicle fleet, upgrades to the maintenance facilities, and upgrades to the substation and power provision network. Some of these things are very customer facing and easy for the public to see, and some of these things are kind of behind the scenes in the Coda infrastructure, but necessary in order to enable electrification. We talked about increases in the Coda Plus on-demand service. So in addition to the service side of that initiative, there's also kind of the physical needs that go along with that. So with increases in service, that means that there needs to be additional vehicles. Additional vehicles need places to live and be maintained. So that means maintenance facilities as well. And then finally, some additional customer amenity provisions would be expanding the bus shelter program. So these would be the physical places and kind of the level of customer comfort against the elements and safety and so on while they're waiting for the buses. So a sort of programmatic budget for allowing for expansion of those kinds of amenities. So clicking forward, we're putting forward some straw man recommendations for where these investments could be in the system. The initial recommendations here are taken in the spirit of kind of aligning different kinds of investments together so that they kind of maximize the impact of those for the riders instead of sort of sprinkling them ad hoc across the region. You really get a better return on your investment if you think about, again, the customer journey from where people start out their transportation journey to where they finish up. But I think, again, overlaying these kinds of investments with the communities of interest area in orange, you can see how that's also been a factor for us to kind of organize these kinds of investment programs. On the next slide, there's some exciting opportunities for us to invest in technology improvements in the Coda network. So looking at funding for exploring and implementing emerging technologies. These can be technologies that the customer sees in terms of information, as well as emerging technologies that help Coda run their business, run their services in a more responsive and effective way. Transit technologies, customer journey tools. So these are things like real-time information systems, enhancements to security amenities, so lighting and monitoring, and traffic operations technologies. So making sure that the transit vehicles, as well as kind of the general transportation network, function as efficiently as they can, kind of as a united network. And then finally, kind of on a softer side, there are a range of programs, policies, and partnerships that can be explored that enhance the mobility and utilization of the transit network. So we will be proposing elements like mobility programs. So these are things like transportation demand management benefit programs and so on. Coordination with
Sorry, we've had some technical difficulties here. I'll get the slides up momentarily.
All right, I will keep winging it. fixed route service improvements. So these could be flexible funds for local jurisdictions to explore, very, very specific improvements to first and last mile capital infrastructure like bus pads, sidewalks, et cetera. Service partnerships, so these would be coordinated efforts between employees, institutions, et cetera. We've talked a bit about the notion of the importance of transit-oriented development, so exploring opportunities for Coda to think about joint development and transit-oriented developments together with groups in the region will be of interest. And then looking at kind of flexible funds for first and last mile connectivity. So in sum, we've got a range of capital improvements from the very, very large to very kind of manageable bite-sized chunks. We've got service enhancements that both support the fixed route network as well as on demand, as well as some opportunities for buckets of flexible funding to deal with partnerships, as well as flexible spending on the part of the agency and perhaps surrounding communities. So that's it for the transit network. My colleague Andy will talk about the non-transit components of the overall mobility network now. So Andy, take it away, please.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody's interest. We're have a little bit more technical information, and then I promise it'll be opened up for discussion and Q&A. So as you've just heard, transit really is the backbone of the network, but this is also about better multimodal connectivity to that backbone and throughout the region. So Justin mentioned that we started with the total universe of projects from various plans and studies within the region. And there are so many unmet needs, it's actually almost overwhelming. But again, we're talking about identified projects with unfunded an unfunded source. The next logical step then is to apply community values and priorities in the form of screening criteria. And that's what we're going to talk about next, to really identify a subset of those projects that might have the best short-term benefit and better align with the goals of the LinkUS initiative. So given the magnitude of the need, we're trying to develop a programmatic scale of projects that through the lens of community need, equity, and safety. So these next series of slides, we want to illustrate the screening criteria that we developed and applied to prioritize the need. So the first one, Justin, is the high capacity transit. Now this is a mode, as we've just heard, but we also used it as a screening criterion because we want to give priority to multimodal projects that connect with these high capacity corridors. And you can see on here that we put a 1 mile buffer around the actual route, a half mile on either side of the route. And this is the case on the next slide as well with high frequency transit. These are existing high frequency transit lines within Coda's network, once again with the 1 mile buffer. Next, we have the Cog Greenways. Again, a regional vision, but it's also used here as a screening criterion. And we want to give priority to mostly bike and ped projects, right, that connect to this network. We want to make those a priority. So we have, in addition, the 1 mile buffer around these. The next piece is Morpsy's high stress bike corridors. These were developed by Morpsy. Obviously, any projects that have been identified in regional plans that align with this network is going to be one of the priority projects. The next piece is the equity map that Justin showed a little bit earlier. These census blocks were identified as part of the city's Vision Zero initiative and later expanded for the whole county. And essentially, if a project overlaps with any of these census blocks, it's considered a priority project regardless of mode. Next, we have the regional high injury network. If projects fall on this network, they are included in the draft priority network of projects. This includes, I might add, pedestrian and roadway projects. And so we're going to walk through a series of slides with maps that show the total universe of projects for each mode with the screening criteria. And that's going to be followed by a map of just the subset of projects proposed as the draft priority network. So in other words, we apply the screening criteria that we just went through to the total universe of projects within a mode, and then the projects that overlap are considered priority network projects. And as Justin mentioned, going a step further, we've also estimated potential capital costs for implementing each of these priority networks by mode. So we'll start with the easiest. Morpsy has already created the Cog Greenways vision and incorporated planned connections within that existing Greenway network. The planned connections are represented here as dotted lines and are roughly around $500 million in capital costs. Next is Bikeways. So there's a lot going on here. Let's break it down. The shaded areas represent the totality of those screening criteria that we just walked through. So the blue shaded areas essentially represent the high capacity and the high frequency transit corridors, the greenways, along with the buffers, the Morpsy high stress network, and the communities of interest. The solid lines represent the total universe of bikeway projects that we identified in plans and studies within the region. So then the next slide represents the subset of bikeway projects that overlap with those screening criteria. So we're essentially talking about 573 miles out of the total 1,267 miles of projects that were identified in the total universe. The cost of those are estimated around 1.2 to 1.3 billion. Next, we'll move on to sidewalks. Again, I know a lot going on here. Sidewalks will involve more of a programmatic approach. As you can see, we have 3,150 miles of total need in the region. And so we didn't identify projects as much as we identified the total need based on Morpsy's comprehensive sidewalk gap analysis. And that's what you see here in the dark blue. We also looked at safe routes to school plans and Coda bus routes, existing Coda bus routes without sidewalks. Believe it or not, there's about 80 miles of Coda fixed route service along streets, not just within the city of Columbus, but within the region without pedestrian facilities. So no sidewalks or ADA facilities. I think we can all agree that fixing that is a priority. So after applying the screening criteria, I should mention we further prioritize sidewalk gaps on arterials and collectors only. So what you see here are sidewalk gaps along arterials and collectors within a half mile of the high capacity and high frequency transit network or greenways, plus all the sidewalk gaps from safe routes to school plans and all gaps within communities of interest. That includes local streets. So the local streets you see here, we included those within the priority network for communities of interest, but not local streets throughout the rest of the county. That represents about 739 miles of sidewalk gaps in the communities of interest of the 1,281 miles that have been prioritized.
Andy, we have a question in the chat. If you could define arterial and collector roadway.
So essentially the major roadways, the ones that are around the neighborhoods that get you to, the highways, the freeways, and to the grocery store, et cetera. It's not the local streets or the neighborhood streets.
These would be the higher speed multi-lane roadways typically.
And I was also going to point out, we were careful not to double count projects. As you see here, we're transitioning into the roadway, but I just wanted to mention that we essentially these roadway projects are proposed as complete street projects. So we reduced the lengths of these projects for our sidewalk estimates because the sidewalks are included within these roadway projects within the scope and costs of these projects. And those were removed from our sidewalk inventory. So for roadways, we're talking about unfunded projects within Morpsy's Metropolitan Transportation Plan. But we also looked at the last 3 funding cycles for Morpsy attributable funding projects that did not receive funding. So they were identified as needs by the communities around Columbus and other jurisdictions, but they were not successful in receiving funding from that cycle of attributable funds. We also removed the highway and freeway projects from those lists. And the draft priority network then is shown here at a potential capital cost of $1.9 to $2.3 billion. So in the end, with all of these modes, it's about taking a more manageable bite of the apple so that we can be more effective in addressing regional needs. It's about prioritizing projects within a multimodal network where the region will see the most value. So at this point, I think Gail, we turn it back to you to facilitate a discussion.
Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand. But in the meantime, we do have some questions we thought would help generate discussion. So if we can go to that first question. Given what you heard from the team, from Andy and from Jennifer and Justin, are we using the right criteria to develop our priorities? You've seen the criteria we've used. We want to make sure that we get some thoughts from you. Are we using the right ones? Any thoughts? You know, it's a dangerous thing when I start calling on people, my friends.
Well, I mean, I can answer
Thank
that,
you.
Gail.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, please do.
No, I mean, I feel that the way you are explained all the different ways of improving mobility in the region and how you went through the filters, I mean, was very helpful to me to understand where they go, and also putting orders of magnitude of dollars to them. I mean, seems to be the right thing. I think at this committee level, I don't think we can refine that any further. Maybe we can prioritize them. I mean, what comes first, you know, would be rather do the greenways or the bike path, or, you know, if there's limited amount of money. But other than that, I felt the presentation was very helpful. But I want to add one thing, and that's the way I raise my hand, is, you know, we always have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? You know, why are we creating mobility? You know, we're not doing mobility for mobility's sake, right? We are doing it for economic development, and we are doing it for addressing social problems in our community to contribute to the prosperity of our community. And the thing that concerns me, although many of us say nice things about equity, it comes out on every slide almost, etc., I'm not seeing any action on those things. I'm not seeing a listed list of items. And I would like to mention 4 of them that I would like to see added to your list, and someone has to deal with it. And it has to be probably a planner, and people like Kim, people like, you know, I mean, again, the planning crowd among you. And the 4 items are, one is, what kind of recommended land use policies around those corridors? It's real nice to have a transit corridor going through a poor neighborhood, but if land use policies on that neighborhood are not coherent with the transit, then it's a waste of money. I mean, it doesn't achieve anything. The second thing is, what kind of simplified entitlements do you recommend that the municipalities, these crosses, adopt so that it gives an incentive to developer, like Craig mentioned something, you know, that we can, you know, it makes it easier for a developer to say, okay, if I develop this, it's simpler, so I can do that. The third thing I would like to say, what is the contribution to solving the affordability of housing issue here? What is the model? What do you recommend? What is the legal framework you suggest in general for the cities to adopt? And I'll be more than happy to volunteer attorneys who will give their time to help you define this. And the last one is, what kind of tax incentives, if any, do you give to the people who create jobs along the corridors rather than somewhere else? So, I mean, if you don't address those issues, I mean, I don't want to be sarcastic, but it's nice. So you can bike everywhere, you can take buses and everything, but to do what? You know, and what is these accompanying things that have to come with it? We should, if we really care about equity, and I think we all do, then we need to identify those policies. We have to go along with the mobility efforts. If not, you know, it's like, you know, lots of talk, but no real action.
Thank you. Anyone else? I see in the chat, Janelle, you said the criteria makes sense. Anything you wanted to add to that?
Miss Gail, there's about 4 hands up also.
Okay, thank you. I do see them.
Yeah, no, Gail, I think a lot of what I've been thinking and what I would contribute has already come out in other people's comments, but the criteria makes sense.
Thank you so much. Josh, I see your hand is up.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm on the road, otherwise I would have my camera on, so I apologize for that. Everything that I just saw was really great, so I'm going to start it off with that. I'm very excited. I think the community will be very excited to see this type of real major investment being looked at. The only concern I have, and something I would like to see more of, is what kind of policies are we going to have in place around this to ensure that it's implemented in a way that really enhances the, urban environment and the safety of these things. Because it's one thing to say, we're going to invest in roadway improvements, and it's another to actually see those improvements improve the built environment and the urban landscape. So again, we invested in Neal Avenue a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, and it's 6 to 8 lanes wide, and doesn't really have a lot of safety characteristics around it in the way that we are looking at if we were adopting things like the NACDO guidelines and really just focusing very heavily on creating a really great urban environment. So that is my concern. So I would like to see those policies be adopted alongside any funding mechanisms, so we're actually achieving the goals that we want, not just doubling down on current things that we already have. But other than that, I think the investments themselves and the things we're hearing are aligned with that. I just want to see those policies adopted so that is just exactly how it gets built, not that we have to have conversations around each project. I don't know if that's a comment or a question.
It's well taken. We thank you for that. Aligns with what we've heard as well, but also that urban investment. Thank you for bringing that up and bringing that to our attention. And so I know that Aaron, Kathy, and we'll start with you. And I see you, Sandy, and I see you, Barbara. So we'll get to you as well. Kathy?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to talk about sidewalks. So it sounds like the criteria is that it's got to be a major road, a multi-lane road, before a sidewalk would be considered. And I just think that's very limited. In my area, there's a lot of subdivisions and small neighborhoods where there's plenty of sidewalks in there, and then you get to the connector road and there's no sidewalk. And there's a grocery store literally half a mile down the street. But if you're in a wheelchair, you're not getting there unless you're somehow driving to go half a mile. And I think we should look at, these areas where I'm not exactly sure how to tell you how to prioritize it, but if we're going to not put a sidewalk on anything that isn't a 4 or 5 lane road, then we're missing a lot of places that really need them, and a lot of them in these communities of interest as well.
Thank you very much. We do get a lot of conversation about sidewalks. So Kathy, you hit that on the head. So yes. Sandy?
So thanks, Gail. I think this is great. Andy, thank you for what you walked everybody through. I think that was actually extremely helpful. I guess I really have more of a comment, and it really is along the lines of the future scalability. And I'm not trying to blow everybody's minds apart on this, because I know we're really, there's a lot here and it's pretty amazing. But one of the things I'm really concerned about is there's a tremendous amount of upward pressure on the region right now in terms of economic development and growth. And that growth, for lots of reasons, is happening way far out beyond where we're thinking right now, which I totally understand. I think what we're doing is great. What I'm worried about, though, is we keep talking about equity, economic development, combining transportation, housing, workforce development, job opportunity. So much of what's happening is pretty far out. And, we're looking at way far now. We're out into counties that are well beyond Franklin, Licking, Delaware, et cetera. And so one of my concerns is, as we do this and spend a lot of money in the region, obviously it's an amazing first step. I'm just curious if there's thought given to scalability for the future. If we continue to grow out these corridors, do those corridors have the ability then to get even further out? And I'm not looking for an answer here in any way. I just want to throw it out there because, man, guys, the jobs that are coming are not on these lines. And that is worrisome to me. Not that that there aren't a lot of good companies doing job creation along those corridors, but the thousands of jobs are way further out. So I just put it out there as we think about this to make sure that we're engaging some other communities in these conversations, because they really need to participate in this. I don't really see them here. And maybe that's purposeful, I'm not sure, but just something to think about for the future.
Thank you so much. I think, Kim, you might add something to that, and then we'll go to Barbara and Lark. I see your hand. Thank you so much.
Just regarding, Sandy, that was a great point, and I think well taken. Part of our current conversations inside of Coda, along with our Morpsy partners, is talking to all the counties surrounding Franklin. We're calling it County Connections, and it's really understanding the county's capacity for mobility options for the workforce moving in and out both ways, and then the connectivity to the urban system at various points, as well as the end of the corridor lines. What does that really mean, and how can we connect better? And I think there's a lot of good conversations going on about that. And then your second point, now it's I should have wrote it down. Anyways, we're working on that, and I know I had a comment for your second point. I'll think of it and I'll send it, and I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. Barbara?
Hi, good afternoon. Absolutely appreciate the prioritization and the criteria that's been presented today. It's very thoughtful. I was thinking back to the conversation at the beginning of the call where you presented sort of our collective thinking about prioritization. And one of the pain points that this group talked about in the first meeting as well is the need for a zoning plan. And that's really, I would call that more of a key enabler, or maybe even table stakes to get this work done. But I think if we get too far down the path and don't go back to that as a key, maybe even a barrier, we could lose sight. So I wanted to mention that, since we all ping that as a high priority. And then wanted to add a dimension to the prioritization around equity, which would be environmental equity. And I suspect it's already captured here by the experts that have presented this to us. But when we're looking to fine tune prioritization, if something is both an equity issue and an environmental equity issue, particularly around health or safety, and I know there are several pockets on our map that would fit that criteria, that might automatically also put it on more of a fast track. And I didn't hear that mentioned. But thank you, very much appreciate the direction.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for that. Lark.
Sure, thank you, Gail, for all of the work that you and your team have done, and for including me in this discussion. I have appreciated the comments around affordable housing, and not really going to get into, definition of affordable housing versus workforce housing and those types of things, because we throw around a lot of terms.
in the housing space without really defining them. But I do want to highlight a couple of things. One is that I hope that as we are discussing these potential savings for developers and others in the space, that those savings are viewed with a lens towards, let's make sure that the savings go to the ultimate tenants and can bring down the AMI targeted rents. If it's just, we're gonna save money for developers to push equity out into suburban hands, and I don't think it really helps us with equity or with the affordable housing crisis that we are facing. And speaking of that crisis, we can talk about economic development, we can talk about equity, we can talk about all of these issues. If we don't consider housing as part of every single conversation that we are having, I don't think we move our community forward. So while we're talking about these corridors, I want to make sure that those corridors are to and from affordable housing and that we are always keeping it at the forefront. And I know we have a lot of issues at the forefront, but if we don't tackle our affordable housing crisis, nothing else will matter, in my opinion. So just a comment, not really a question, but I don't want us to lose focus there.
Thank you so much. And I know regional housing strategy and a focus on that it bubbled up from our survey as well. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
And that ties in with the whole equity issue. And I can't remember who brought up the point about what we've dealt with in this community in the past with redlining and everything else, where we put our freeways, but all of that has played into why we are facing the housing crisis that we are facing now. And we need to start righting some of those wrongs as part of this effort.
Thank you. And with that, I know Kevin and his team have done quite a bit of research and presentations around just that, Lark, and he has his hands up. He had it up for a while. It's just a nice segue into that since you brought that up. Kevin, I know you might have a comment and some questions.
Sure, thank you, Gail. I wanted to introduce myself to those of you I've not met. I'm Kevin Wheeler. I'm an assistant director in the development department, and I'm focused on growth policy. And one of my biggest tasks is to move the city zoning code update forward. We're right now wrapping up the first phase of that effort, which was to assess the current code, what are the challenges and pitfalls of the code, and begin to develop a game plan for updating it. And the city has not comprehensively updated its zoning code since the 50s. There's probably not a single word left from the 50s because we've updated elements of it along the way, but we've never really taken the time to look at it from a comprehensive perspective. And we know, that it's not working in a lot of ways. We know it's not supportive of transit and affordable housing in the way we want it to be. We have an over-reliance on site-by-site negotiation for projects, which puts, most of the meaningful development that we see in the city in a, often going through a pretty challenging process. We know that it's complex, and because of that complexity, it's not very accessible to a lot of folks. And so we have a save the date email that many of you are probably going to get here in the next day or so, asking you to set aside either 3 p.m. or 6 p.m. on October 20th. Again, that's 3 p.m. or 6 p.m. on October 20th. We're going to have our consultant team sharing what they've learned through the assessment process and outlining some of their priority recommendations for moving forward. This is really challenging work. It's complex to do a zoning code update for a city the size of Columbus, but we know that we have to do it. And I'll let you in on a secret, which is that we also recognize the imperative of focusing on these corridors and having strategies in place for them. Zoning is something that can't be changed without city council action. We have to do a lot of public outreach and communication, and we'll be doing that. We're going to be working on a process to make sure that we are able to engage folks who, frankly, are usually not at the table. We did a survey earlier, had 3,000 people participate, telling us what they felt the priorities should be for a code update. And we worked really hard to try to expand the outreach of that survey, and we still saw underrepresentation among minority groups, among renters, among lower income folks. And that's important because when we looked at what they said, we saw that the priorities that these groups have kind of varies depending on where they're at in life, what the community they're coming from. And so we want to make sure that as we move into phase 2, that we're doing everything we can to capture that. So it is not going to be fast or easy, but we recognize its importance. And I think that we particularly recognize, again, the critical timing of transit-oriented development and mixed-use corridors. So I just wanted to share that with folks because I didn't get a chance to join the last conversation, and I knew that was a topic of interest. So I'll be happy to talk to any of you offline if you want to talk about it more. But that's what I wanted to share. Thanks, Gail.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks for sharing that. Leah, I see your hand up if you have a comment or a question.
Thank you, Gail. I do have just a few comments and really reflective on this is such a huge body of work that we're trying to coalesce into this path forward. So acknowledging the work the team has done, I had a couple of things. One is that as we sit in a state of ever-changing work environments, how is that reflective in what we're talking about today? Like, most strategic planning has historically been rooted in the data. You go back, you get some facts, and then you feed that into your plan. A lot of what we're talking about in strategic planning now is about watching the patterns, which I think is even what Sandy was alluding to, is what are the patterns of development, not what we know has happened already, but what are the patterns that we see evolving and emerging, and how are we preparing this plan for that? I think when I did my prioritization, I prioritized sustainability. Lark and I have been chatting, is that we probably define that differently. I define that as this plan and this whatever we come up with has to stand. It has to stand beyond the livelihood of this group. It has to stand beyond any political changes and the crisis of 10, 15, 20 years from now. So that sustainability and that preparedness that we need to be embedding in this plan, I like to see that as reflective of what we are sitting in today, where, again, my office, I'm still at home, and some of you are in the office, and what that flexibility looks like and how that's changed transit and transportation and all of our actual future development plans and patterns. So that'd be one. My other thought was on equity. We use that term in many ways. In a lot of definitions, equity is a value. It isn't a future state. Again, all of us would probably define that equity proposition differently, and we do use that term very, very broadly today. But part of it is how we go about this work. What choice points do we have to make sure to do just what Kevin was talking about, that it's not the dominant perspective that we plan for, it is the perspective of the many. And that's a different, that's changing how we even have these conversations. And I know that's part of the future state, Gail, that you're talking about with different other engagement opportunities, but we have to be willing to let go of some things that we may hold dear or that we may prioritize to let those other more diverse voices be seen and heard in this process. So just a different positioning around equity and what we think that means and how we advance that as we go forward. Because through this process, it's not a future state to get to. Through this process, we can be advancing that equity if we are intentional about it and make sure that is the forefront of any activity that we take on.
Gail, could I maybe
Yes,
address
please.
just quickly a first element, Leah, of what you talked about in terms of the unknown? It's a really important point. We've discussed that too. On the one hand, we've gone through such a huge set of potential projects that I think we know this is decades of implementation. And somebody else noted, further prioritization to get to a point of understanding what really are the near-term investments beyond, 3 corridors that we've identified, but with all these other networks, we can't necessarily consider that to be set in stone. These are lines on a map that are helping us understand an order of magnitude of investment. But Andy mentioned this word or a phrase, programmatic bucket. There needs to be a level of flexibility to be able to respond to changing conditions and whether it's workforce patterns or where housing is happening or emerging needs that we don't know now, but to be able to have that funding source in place to be able to respond to those things. So we might have lines on a map that help us have a general path forward. We'll need to work out a process for understanding how we can actually prioritize that to respond to immediate needs.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Justin. And we see sustainability, Barbara, your comment, very, very important perspective. Then we need to see what that means. It has several meanings, different meanings for different people. So really honing in on that and what we mean in this initiative, what that looks like. And I know from a workforce development perspective, I know Nationwide is a huge employer, as are so many others, but I wanted to call on Chad to see if he had any additional perspectives or any other thoughts related to our work, our priority networks, any other insights. Chad?
Yeah, thanks, Gail. It's a great conversation. A lot of wonderful perspectives. It is built upon a lot of great work by the professional teams. I thought Sandy's comments were really interesting on the growth outside of the core taking place, which has been happening for a while, but it might even be accelerated now. You know, as a larger employer, of which there are a few others on the call, we have employees who are 3 county rings out who come to downtown Columbus, usually each and every day when we're all in the office. And you know, while we have folks from all walks of life coming to downtown Columbus, I do wholeheartedly agree with the focus on the core of the city. As a former City of Columbus employee earlier in my career, I feel like we are still dealing with some of the issues we were at that point in time. So I'm thrilled the city is going through the process of updating the zoning code. That is a heavy lift, but it is really, really important to set the blueprint for the community going forward. But again, all these things have got to work together and appear as seamless as they can be if we're going to move the community forward with pace and intent. So thanks, Gail.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Lark, is your hand up as well? Okay, very good. Any of our Columbus State, Rebecca, anything from education side of the house?
Gail, Craig has his hand up.
Craig does. Thank you so much. Craig, sorry, I missed your hand.
I just wanted to comment on some of the points that like Sandy, Barbara, Kevin, and Yarma brought up about the zoning component to this. By the way, I think the priorities are spot on. I think the staff's done a terrific job in outlining them for us. But zoning, you know, is a key element to this, and we've been talking about kind of largely in connection to the city of Columbus. And my city, Westerville, has been going through a zoning code revision from use-based code to form-based code for, I've lost track of the number of years that we've been doing that. It's a heavy lift, you know, as Chad said. But the zoning elements that tie into the corridors really need to go beyond the city of Columbus. If the corridors ultimately are going to work and have that sustainability, you know, that I think Barbara was talking about outside of the, say, 270, or at least the inner core of the high level of service. There are a number of things I think that can be suggested short of an entire zoning code revision that we can suggest to the other municipalities. My city already has adopted, and this has been 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, a density bonus for a transit-related development. That's, and Yarma was asking kind of from the development perspective, you know, what can we do to make this happen in an equitable way? That's one element of it. It also plays into affordability or attainability, is the term I'm using anymore, because density, you know, drives the ability to keep costs, you know, more reasonable. So I think we do need to think in terms of some key elements of zoning that can be suggested to all of the municipalities, not just focus on, you know, making Columbus completely revise their plan, because that's a big job. The other piece that I wanted to mention, Yarma also brought up tax incentives. right now the cities, Columbus or any of the other municipalities, going to be limited by what the state code lets us do with CRA abatements or TIFs, but they're primarily job driven. They're about revitalization or job creation, and I think if municipalities have to maybe change their thinking a bit in terms of what is a driver for job creation, and it's not literally just always the number of new jobs that can be located in or out of a location, but the element that transit has in that. And I know my city has picked up on that with the number of abatements that have been given, because the abatement related to the transit was necessary to get the jobs, because a lot of the workforce was literally planning on traveling in on the BRT. And as you start seeing more BRT lines in these corridors, I think that's going to be a more attractive thing to the other municipalities. So anyway, it's been a great conversation. I just wanted to throw those comments in.
I would like to intervene to support what Craig just said, because there are many municipalities have thought through this. They may pass rules or regulations. I think the LinkUS should put together some kind of a template, the recommended template from zoning, using the best practices of different municipalities, even different cities, Charlotte, Austin, it doesn't matter, which is the template, then it is suggested to each municipality, township, county, the system crosses, and for them to adopt or not to adopt, but at least the thinking is done, and is done also from a detached way. That means that the template is created without worrying the politics of one small municipality. I mean, Whitehall has good ideas, Westerville had good ideas, Columbus had good ideas. So why don't we create a LinkUS template covering all those issues? How do we deal with housing issues? How to deal with zoning issues? How do we simplify entitlements and things like that? I'm sorry I'm repeating myself again, but I mean, that is, I think, very critical.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we do have another question, comment, perspective from Rebecca Butler from Columbus State. So Rebecca, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gail. I've really enjoyed listening today. I was unable to make the first session, so this has been really rich, and I've appreciated all of the information. I would just echo a lot of what's been said, but do it from a student perspective. As you know, Columbus State in many respects represents the totality of the Columbus region. And when we think about equitable access to education, equitable access to housing, equitable access to jobs, our students and how we think about connecting them to their lives that they already have, which in many cases are complex. They are parents, they are caring for parents, they are working already in many ways. Really being clear about the access to not only education, but access to jobs through mobility. We hear it over and over and over again. It is a significant barrier. It's a significant barrier for inclusive economic prosperity for our students. So just from a student perspective, from an education perspective, connecting the ecosystem from a mobility standpoint, but from all of the barriers to inclusive success is important. And I would also add this, that as we're looking at other cities, and as we do this work together, many of us have strong connections through our industries in those cities. So understanding, for example, how Charlotte has thought about this from a community college, from an education perspective. What does that look like? How has Charlotte's success impacted prosperous access and inclusive access to education that led to high wage careers and jobs? I think there's opportunities for us to do some deeper connection as we're going through this phase of the work. So again, thanks for the opportunity to share it from the students' perspective, because they are our community. So thanks.
Thank you so much. And we have about 7 minutes before we close out. We want to be mindful of your time. And before I turn it over to you, Rory, I want to go back to Joanna, who may have some comments. That's rich discussion today. And then Rory, after Joanna, we'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thanks, Gail. All I can say is I'll reiterate the thanks. I kind of put a call to action out there when we started the meeting at, was it 2 hours ago? I don't know. But that call to action was, please, let's have this discussion. And it's pretty clear to me that the brilliant minds on the screen already get it, that right, something's got to change. But your leadership in influencing how that changes, not just based on what has been done in the past, but what we see coming, is really important. So I really appreciate your engagement today. It was pretty incredible, I think more than we even anticipated. And I really heard everyone saying the same concept, but in different ways of execution. You know, I'll pick on Rebecca just because she was the last speaker, but knowing that certain institutions have connections in other communities and learning from all of this, I want to reassure you that the amazing team who has put together today's work, they're on it and they're doing a great job. So I'd like to, maybe give them a round of applause because they deserve it. There's a lot, there are hundreds of hours that go into this work to prepare for meeting with you. So just thank you for the engagement. And I hope next meeting, when we meet with other cities who have gone through this growing pain, that you will be just as engaged.
Thank you so much. And Rory, you have the last word today.
All right. All I can say is wow. Every time we have a steering committee meeting, the feedback that we get is just tremendous. And want to thank everybody for their great input, and also thank Gail for leading the discussion. Today, our LinkUS team provided a thorough overview of all the different transportation priority networks. While our high capacity rapid transit corridors are the backbone of our initiative, improvements to our other priority networks are essential to creating a truly interconnected mobility system that advances our goals to expanding regional prosperity, sustainability, and quality of life. LinkUS will require significant investment, as we've all seen from the slides, but the cost of doing nothing will be far greater, as Kim pointed out in her earlier presentation, and Yarmir as well. If we continue the path the way that we have been growing, we're going to have $10 billion more in increased capital costs, additional annual costs of $8,500 to households, 30% more greenhouse gas emissions, and 112 square miles of additional land consumption. With your leadership, we're going to create a program that delivers value to our community at the highest return on investment while providing equitable opportunity for all. Well, we will have some follow-up items from today's meeting later this week, including another survey that we'd love for the steering committee to do. Your feedback is very helpful to the administration committee as they work to build the LinkUS program. And like we did today, we'll share those results of the survey at our next meeting. On October 19th, the Urban Land Institute will be conducting a transit symposium with the LinkUS team and our peer cities. In the afternoon, we'll host our next steering committee meeting. And as mentioned before, we're going to hear directly from representatives of our peer cities about how they constructed their mobility programs and brought them into fruition. And then we'll also begin to explore the funding options to make LinkUS a reality. We can also use your help to advance LinkUS outside of our regular meetings. We'd welcome your help to inform your colleagues and organizations that you're involved in LinkUS. We've developed a LinkUS Ambassadors Toolkit and can provide you with all the materials you need to spread the LinkUS message. And I'd like to thank fellow steering committee member, Kathy Cowan-Becker, for her work to promote LinkUS through the Sierra Club and affiliated organizations at the recent Community Speak Out for Transit Justice. If you'd like to be a LinkUS ambassador, please let Gail or I know, and we'll get you set up. And I want to close the meeting the same way Joanna Pinkerton kicked it off, by reminding everyone about the tremendous opportunity that we have with LinkUS and our aligned regional priorities. Noted urban affairs analyst Aaron Wren describes this opportunity best. He writes, Columbus is both operating from a baseline of strength and also at a point where it is still on the way up as a city. Columbus has never been a larger, more important, more prominent city in the world than it is right now, and it has the potential to reach still higher. Not every city and not every generation is granted the opportunity that Columbus has right now. While Aaron Wren is writing about the city of Columbus, the same opportunity is true about our region. We all know that we're growing in population, but I don't know that a lot of people know that our region is also truly an international economic powerhouse with a gross metropolitan product of 137.2 billion. Our gross metropolitan product, or GMP, is larger than the gross state product of 18 states. And it is larger than the gross domestic product of 143 countries around the world. Our region is home to 16 Fortune 1000 headquarters operations and is #1 for growth in population, jobs, and GDP of the Midwest's 10 largest metros. For all these positives, though, as we've talked about many times, there are vast differences in access and opportunity in our region. In recent rankings, our region ranks #8 among large metropolitan areas for overall income segregation, #4 for segregation of people with college degrees, and #10 for segregation of working class people. While these are major challenges, what is encouraging is that our region finally understands that we cannot be truly prosperous unless all of us are sharing in our success. We're at a historic moment where we can align our efforts to address our region's biggest challenges. As a result, our region has put forward great initiatives like the Rise Together Blueprint, the city's our climate action plan, and also the Morpsy's regional housing strategy. These efforts cannot be successful without LinkUS, and our region cannot prosper unless all of these initiatives are aligned. We're so grateful for the opportunity to work with you and so appreciative for the service, expertise, and passion that you bring to LinkUS. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions or feedback in the meantime. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, and please follow us on our social media platforms as well. Have a good evening. Thank you.